There is a bronze man in Central Park. Or there was. He stood on a granite pedestal near Fifth Avenue and 103rd Street, pigeons settling on his shoulders, joggers passing without lifting their eyes, the city moving around him the way cities move around old monuments, incuriously, as though presence long enough becomes permission. He wore a coat. He held instruments. He had a name cast into the stone below his feet: J. Marion Sims, 1813 to 1883, founder of modern gynecology. Beneath that, smaller, benefactor of women. People walked past him for 180 years. In the spring of 2018, workers came with a crane. They took him down. The pedestal stood empty for a while, which is its own kind of statement. The absence of something that was always wrong, still registering as a wound, still saying something about who we were willing to honor, and for how long. Some people protested the removal. They said he was a great man. They said we were erasing history. Here is what that history actually contains. J. Marion Sims developed the surgical technique for repairing a vesicovaginal fistula. This is a devastating injury, a tear between the bladder and the vaginal wall caused by prolonged obstructed labor, and in the mid-19th century, it condemned women to a lifetime of incontinence, infection, and social exile. The repair Sims perfected has since saved or restored the quality of life for millions of women. This is true. It is also true that he developed this technique by performing experimental surgery repeatedly on enslaved black women in Montgomery, Alabama, without anesthesia. Both of these things are true. The statue celebrated one. It was built on the other. Sims arrived in Alabama in the 1840s with ambitions and a theory. The theory was a common one in the medicine of his time, derived from a patchwork of pseudoscientific racism and economic convenience. That black people experienced pain differently from white people, less acutely, less consciously, with a nervous system somehow calibrated by providence or biology to endure what white bodies could not. This was not fringe opinion. It appeared in medical textbooks. It was cited in surgical papers. It was taught to students. It was used, with the efficiency of all useful lies, to justify what would otherwise require justification. In 1845, a planter named Westcott brought Sims a 17-year-old enslaved girl named Anarcha. She had been in labor for 3 days. The baby died. Anarcha survived, but the injury she sustained, a fistula, had left her incontinent and in chronic pain. Westcott, calculating the reduced value of a domestic worker who could not perform domestic work, brought her to the young surgeon who had been speaking publicly about an interest in this particular condition. Sims examined her. He saw in her injury a research problem. He asked Westcott if he could keep her for a while. Anarcha remained in Sims's care, if that word can be used, for 4 years. Over those 4 years, Sims also acquired 2 other enslaved women, named Lucy and Betsy, their owners similarly persuaded that surrendering them for experimental purposes was a reasonable trade for the possibility of a cure. Lucy and Betsy underwent multiple surgeries. They were held on a table in a small outbuilding behind Sims's practice, surrounded by male medical colleagues who had been invited to observe. The operations were performed without anesthesia. Sims would later write, in his 1876 autobiography, that he did not use anesthesia because he did not believe these patients needed it. And this belief, he made clear, was not incidental to the proceedings. It was foundational. Anarcha underwent 30 operations over those 4 years. 30. The number is in the record. Sims published his findings. He was a meticulous documenter, an ambitious man who understood that the path to medical eminence ran through publication, and he published his results in the American Journal of the Medical Sciences in 1852, describing his technique in the clinical language of a man who believed he was doing science. The paper includes references to his subjects, unnamed in the text, but cross-referenced in his notes to the women who had provided the data. His prose is precise. It is the precision of a man who has no reason to feel he is doing anything wrong. This is what is important to understand. Sims did not believe he was committing atrocities. He believed he was advancing medicine. The horror is not in his self-conception. The horror is in the system that made his self-conception possible. A system in which the bodies of enslaved black women were available for experimentation by legal right, in which the belief that they felt less pain was not merely a private prejudice, but a published and accepted medical position, and in which the career that would be built on their suffering would be crowned, a generation later, with a statue in the greatest park of the greatest city in the country. The horror is in the pedestal. What does it mean to build a medical specialty on unconsenting bodies? This question is not rhetorical. It has an answer, and the answer is not simple. The technique Sims perfected is real, and it has repaired real injuries, and the women who have benefited from its application over the past century and a half include women of every race and nation. The good is not cancelled by the method, but the method is not cancelled by the good. Both remain. And what remains alongside them, what has never been satisfactorily accounted for, is the question of who was considered available for that foundational suffering. Why were the experimental subjects black women? Why not white women with the same injury? The answer is not medical. It is legal. It is economic. Enslaved women did not need to consent because, under the law of Alabama in 1845, they could not consent. They were property. Their pain was their owner's property. And their owner had decided, in a calculation as cold as any clinical trial protocol, that experimental surgery was a reasonable allocation of that property's suffering. Once Sims had perfected his technique, he left Alabama for New York. He founded the first dedicated women's hospital in the United States, the Woman's Hospital, established in 1855. He performed the procedure he had spent 4 years developing on white women. He used anesthesia. The record is clear on this point. His own published accounts confirm it. The women whose bodies had served as his laboratory received no further mention. Lucy and Betsy disappear from the historical record entirely. Anarcha's name survives only because a single researcher, more than a century later, went back through the notes. She had no grave marker. She had no public acknowledgement. She did not attend the ceremony when the statue went up in 1894. She had been dead for decades, unnamed in the official narrative of the specialty her suffering had built. What the doctors in Sims's circle wrote about his work was uniformly admiring. The American Journal of the Medical Sciences called his 1852 paper a landmark contribution. His colleagues voted him the first president of the American Gynecological Society. When he died in 1883, the New York Times ran an obituary that celebrated his legacy as a benefactor of women. The women it was referring to were not Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. The statue went up 11 years after his death. It stood for 124 years. It would be convenient if Sims were an aberration, a rogue physician whose methods were condemned by his contemporaries, a monster who slipped through the cracks of a system that was otherwise scrupulous about consent and equal care. The record does not support this convenience. What the record supports is continuity. Sims was not a rogue. He was a pioneer, and his pioneering took the form it did because the system in which he practiced made it possible, and that system did not end when he died. It adapted. It found new institutional homes. It developed new justifications for the same basic operation. The use of black bodies as raw material for the advancement of medicine that would benefit primarily white patients. The pattern begins before Sims and continues after him. In the years following the Civil War, as formerly enslaved people gained legal personhood, but not economic or social power, the conditions for that extraction changed in form, but not in substance. Black patients who sought care at the newly established charity hospitals of the post-war South found themselves in wards that functioned in part as training grounds for white medical students. Surgical procedures were performed on black patients for teaching purposes, procedures that would have required additional consent and considerably more explanation if the patient were white and paying. The surgical suite was democratic in its technique and democratic in its price. It was free, and in exchange, the patient's body became a classroom. The medical schools of the late 19th century had another need. Anatomy required cadavers. Cadavers required bodies. The legal supply was limited. In most states, the only bodies legally available for dissection were those of executed criminals or those who died in public poorhouses without relatives to claim them. The demand far exceeded this supply, and so a trade developed, operating primarily at night, in which bodies were exhumed from black cemeteries and delivered to medical schools. This was known. It was not a rumor. It generated newspaper coverage, coroner investigations, and occasional prosecutions, none of which substantially disrupted the practice. The trade was known in black communities by a name, night doctors, that served as both warning and testimony. The fear of night doctors was dismissed by white observers as superstition. It was not superstition. It was an accurate description of a documented practice, and the communities that maintained that fear were maintaining it on the basis of evidence. This evidence moved through black communities not as written record, but as embodied knowledge, the kind of knowledge that survives in families and churches and neighborhoods, the kind that is passed down in the specific tone of voice a grandmother uses when she tells you not to go to the county hospital if you can help it. This knowledge did not make it into medical journals. It did not appear in the footnotes of the papers that celebrated the advancement of anatomy. But it was there, and it shaped something that would persist for generations, a deep, historically informed distrust of medical institutions. The medical establishment would later describe this distrust as irrational. The evidence suggests the opposite. By the time J. Marion Sims had been dead for 50 years, the basic infrastructure of medical exploitation was in place. There were the assumptions about black pain tolerance, about black intelligence, about the relative value of black lives, that made experimentation seem self-evidently acceptable. There were the institutions, the charity hospital, the public ward, the medical school, where black bodies were most available. There were the career incentives, publication, prestige, specialization, that rewarded the use of those bodies. And there was the silence, the institutional silence that surrounded the practice, the way in which none of this appeared as scandal, because scandal requires a disruption of the expected. What the medical establishment expected when it looked at a black patient in 1890, or 1905, or 1920, was availability. The disruption would have been refusal. There were also the sterilizations. In the decades that followed Sims, as the eugenics movement crossed the Atlantic from its British theoretical origins and found enthusiastic American institutional support, the reproductive capacity of black women became an object of particular medical attention. The procedure was sometimes performed under the cover of another surgery, an appendectomy, a fibroid removal, without the patient's knowledge or consent. In Mississippi and several other southern states, this happened often enough that it acquired a regional nickname among black women and the physicians who served them, the Mississippi appendectomy. It was not a joke. It was a medical description. It was also a crime in the technical legal sense, and it was perpetrated systematically in public hospitals by licensed physicians with the tacit approval of state governments that were simultaneously pursuing legal sterilization programs, targeting the unfit, a category that in Southern medical and legal practice mapped with uncomfortable consistency onto black women who were considered to have too many children, or who were young, or who were poor, or who were, in the coldly bureaucratic language of the era, a burden on public resources. The women who underwent these procedures without consent often did not know for years, if they found out at all. The discovery sometimes came when they tried to become pregnant, and could not. The discovery sometimes came, never. The records, when they existed, used clinical language. The clinical language did not record what was taken. This is the world in which Macon County, Alabama existed in 1932. It is important to hold this in mind. The Tuskegee syphilis study did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a particular medical culture, a particular set of assumptions, a particular history that had been running, quietly and in plain sight, for the better part of a century. When the United States Public Health Service designed a study that would use black men as experimental subjects without their knowledge, they were not inventing a new practice. They were institutionalizing an old one. The town of Tuskegee sits in Macon County in the Alabama Black Belt, named for the dark, rich soil, the soil that had made Cotton King and slavery profitable, and the county, in the early 20th century, a landscape of sharecropping poverty. By 1932, Macon County was roughly 82% black and nearly entirely poor, the agricultural economy having collapsed in the boll weevil devastation of the preceding decade and never recovered. Medical care was not unavailable in Macon County. It was, for most black residents, practically inaccessible. There was one black physician for every 1,000 black residents, no functioning public health infrastructure, and no money, in any case, to pay for care that might have been available. The average black sharecropper in Macon County in 1932 had never seen a doctor in his adult life and had no reasonable expectation of ever doing so. This is the world Ezell Tanner knew. He was 43 years old in the fall of 1932, a sharecropper who worked 12 acres of cotton on a white landowner's farm outside Notasulga, a town of a few hundred people 17 miles from Tuskegee itself. He had a wife, Fay, who was 31 and 2 children, and a 3-room house with a wood stove and a well that went dry in August. He was not a sick man. He believed himself not to be a sick man, but he was tired in the particular way that men who work from before dawn to after dark in Alabama, heat, become tired. A tiredness that lives in the joints and the lower back, and occasionally rises into headaches, and a vague aching that is hard to locate. He had heard about something coming to the county. Free medical care, some people said. Free treatment for bad blood. Bad blood was the term in common use in the black community of Macon County for a cluster of vague complaints, fatigue, aching, general illness, and also, though not exclusively, for syphilis, which was prevalent in the county. The terminology was not precise. It did not need to be. In a community with almost no access to diagnosis, the specific nature of an illness mattered less than the fact of feeling unwell and having somewhere to go. When the Public Health Service representatives came to the churches and schools of Macon County in October and November of 1932, they came bearing an offer: free physical examinations, free treatment, free meals on the days of testing, transportation provided. It was, in the context of Macon County's poverty and medical isolation, an extraordinary offer. People came. Ezell came. He sat in the examination room at the Tuskegee Institute, the great school founded by Booker T. Washington, its name now attached to the study, an irony that would take decades to fully register. And he was examined by Dr. Harlan Meacham, who was a physician with the United States Public Health Service, a 44-year-old man from North Carolina, who had been recruited to run the study's clinical operations. Meacham was not a cruel man, in the conventional sense. He was a precise man, an organized man, a man who had spent his career in public health because he believed, in a general and somewhat abstracted way, that science served the public good. He believed this while looking at the results of Ezell Tanner's blood test, and he believed it while recording those results in the study's intake forms, and he believed it while deciding what to tell Ezell. What he told Ezell was that he had bad blood, that the government program was going to take care of him, that he should come back for treatment. What the intake form recorded in the clinical shorthand of the Public Health Service, was something else. Ezell Tanner, Macon County, Alabama, case number 114. Positive serologic test for syphilis, enrolled in control group, untreated. Ezell walked out into the Alabama afternoon, grateful. He had never seen a doctor before. He had never been examined, never been tested, never been told by someone with professional credentials what was happening inside his body. The experience had the quality, for a man who had lived his entire life outside the reach of institutions, of being seen, of being counted. He told Faye that evening that the government was taking care of them, that the doctor was going to treat his bad blood, that things were going to be better. Faye listened. She had questions she did not entirely know how to phrase. She asked if they had told him what was wrong. He said bad blood. She said yes, but what kind? He said that's what the treatment was for. She let it go. The meal they had been given that day, the hot food, the real coffee, was the best either of them had eaten in months. She let it go. The study that enrolled Ezell and 398 other black men in Macon County in the fall and winter of 1932 was officially titled The Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. The title is its own document. The word untreated was there from the beginning. It was not concealed from the researchers. It was the operational description of the study's design. The Public Health Service had identified a significant gap in the medical literature. While there were studies of syphilis in white patients, and there were studies of treated syphilis, there was no long-term study of what happened to the human body, specifically the black male body, when syphilis was allowed to run its course without intervention. The scientific question was legitimate, in the narrow technical sense that it had not been answered. The method chosen to answer it was to withhold treatment from living human beings without telling them that was what was happening. This decision was made by people with names and titles and offices in Washington, D.C. Dr. Talia Farrow Clark, chief of the Venereal Disease Division of the Public Health Service, designed the study. Dr. Raymond Vonderlehr, who later became the chief of the Venereal Disease Division himself, supervised its early implementation. The study was reviewed, approved, and funded through the ordinary channels of Federal Public Health Administration. It appeared in the published literature, not as a secret, not as a classified program, but as peer-reviewed science. The Journal of the American Medical Association published papers drawing on the study's data in 1936. Medical students read these papers. Professors cited them. The study's existence was not concealed from the American medical community. The American medical community knew about it and did not stop it. In those first years, the study offered aspirin and iron tonics as treatment, placebo interventions that produced the experience of receiving care without providing any. Nurse Willa Greer, who worked at the John A. Andrew Hospital at Tuskegee, and who processed many of the study participants, received the aspirin shipments along with the intake documentation. She was told the purpose of the study, the official purpose, the one that described it as investigating the natural history of syphilis in a historically underserved population. She was not told, in those early months, what she was increasingly coming to understand. Willa Greer was 29 years old in 1932, a graduate of the Tuskegee Institute's nursing program, one of a small number of black nurses in the county with formal credentials. She had worked hard to get those credentials, had worked against assumptions and obstacles that she carried the memory of in her body, and she had gotten them and built a practice in her community, and understood that her ability to remain in that practice depended on her relationships with the institutions and the physicians who controlled access to it. This is the matrix in which her choices existed. She watched men come through the intake process. She watched them leave with their aspirin and their confidence in the free treatment they were receiving. She saw the forms. She understood, by 1934, that the treatment was not treatment. She processed men she had known since childhood, men who worked farms near her family's land, men whose wives she saw at church on Sundays. She processed them through a system that was using them, and she said nothing, because she did not know what could be said that would be listened to, and because the machinery was federal and vast, and she was a black woman in Alabama in 1934, and the calculation of what it would cost her to speak and whether it would do any good was a calculation that produced a particular kind of silence. This silence is not simple. It is not the silence of someone who did not know. It is the silence of someone who knew and could not find the mechanism for speaking that would be worth the cost. Complicity under those conditions is not the same as complicity freely chosen, and the analysis that assigns her the same moral weight as Dr. Meacham misunderstands the architecture of power she was operating inside. But the men still didn't get treated. They came in with their aspirin bottles and left without penicillin, and her silence was part of the machinery that allowed that to continue, even when she understood what the machinery was doing. Meacham published his first paper drawing on the study's data in 1934. It appeared in Venereal Disease Information, a public health service journal, and its language was the language of science. Populations, incidence rates, serologic findings, comparative morbidity data. He referred to the study participants as subjects and to their medical histories as clinical material. He did not write about Ezel Tanner or the aspirin or the free hot meals. He wrote about data. The data came from human beings who had been told they were receiving treatment. This detail did not appear in the paper. It was not considered relevant to the scientific findings. Faye Tanner began asking questions in earnest around 1937. Ezel had been in the study for 5 years. He went to his appointments faithfully. They were given a stipend for their time, a few dollars that, in the economy of a Macon County sharecropper in the Depression, were not trivial. And he came home with his aspirin and his assurance that the doctors were monitoring his condition. But Faye could see things the doctors were presumably monitoring. She could see that he tired more easily. She could see the way he sometimes put his hand to his head, with an expression that he didn't want her to notice. She asked the nurses at his next appointment if there was something more that could be done, something stronger. The nurses, some of whom were processing the same intake forms that Willa Greer was processing, gave her the answer they had been trained to give. The doctor was taking good care of him. The program was doing everything that could be done. He was being monitored closely. Faye was not stupid. She was not uneducated, in the meaningful sense of having learned to think carefully about what she was being told. She had grown up in a county where medical authority was white and institutional, and often wrong about black bodies, and she had an instinct that the careful vagueness of these reassurances meant something she wasn't being allowed to know. But the vocabulary to name what she suspected, that the treatment wasn't treatment, that the men were not patients but subjects, that the free program that felt like benevolence was something else entirely. That vocabulary was not available to her. It lived in the internal documents of the Public Health Service, not in the churches and schools of Macon County. The year 1943 was the year that should have ended the study. In 1943, penicillin became available as a treatment for syphilis. The drug worked. It was not experimental. It was not expensive. It was distributed through military and public health channels across the United States. Men with syphilis were being cured. The disease that had been considered a death sentence, or more precisely, a slow and ravaging sentence of progressive destruction to the cardiovascular and nervous systems, was now definitively treatable. The men in the Tuskegee study were not treated. The decision not to offer penicillin to the study participants was deliberate. It was documented. Dr. John Heller, who directed the Venereal Disease Division of the PHS from 1943 to 1948, later testified that the purpose of the study, observing the natural history of untreated syphilis, would be undermined if treatment were provided. The scientific value of the data required the continued withholding of treatment. The question of what the human cost of that data would be was not considered in those terms. The subjects were not patients seeking treatment. They were, in the language of the study's own records, material. When the Second World War began, several of the study participants were drafted. The Selective Service, operating through standard channels, flagged many of them for venereal disease treatment. The military required soldiers to be treated for syphilis as a matter of operational readiness. The Public Health Service contacted the local draft board to have the study participants exempted from this requirement, specifically so they would not receive treatment that would contaminate the study data. The draft board cooperated. The participants were not told why they were not being treated. They were told, when they asked, that the government's program was handling their care. The government's program was, in fact, handling their care. It was just handling it in the specific sense that it was making sure they did not receive any. This is the passage in the study's history that the word betrayal cannot fully accommodate. These men had enrolled in a federal program because they had never had access to medical care. They had stayed in it through poverty and depression and war because it offered them the continuity of what they understood to be treatment, because the free meals and the small stipends and the burial insurance the program provided. The burial insurance, offered as an enrollment incentive, which meant the study planners had from the beginning anticipated the deaths, were genuine material benefits in their specific economic circumstances. And the federal government, having recruited them on the basis of that need, having cultivated their trust over years and then decades, had used that trust to ensure they remained available as data sources. The draft board intervention is the moment that makes the intentionality undeniable. The participants could have been treated. They were prevented from being treated. This was not oversight. This was policy. Ezell Tanner was 55 years old in 1944. He was still in the study. He still did not know he had syphilis. He had been told, repeatedly, over 12 years, that he had bad blood, and that the program was treating it. And he had no reason not to believe this because the doctors and nurses were credentialed and institutional, and because the alternative, that the government was allowing his disease to progress untreated while telling him otherwise, was not a hypothesis available to a man who had, until 1932, never seen a doctor, and who had no framework for imagining the deliberate withholding of care inside the structure of apparent care. The disease was in his cardiovascular system by now. Tertiary syphilis reaches the heart and the aorta, causing inflammation and structural damage that manifests as chest pain and fatigue, and eventually as the kind of failure that kills. Ezell knew he was not well. He attributed his illness to aging, to the years in the fields, to the ordinary deterioration of a man's body under decades of hard physical labor. The doctors said he was being monitored. He believed them. Faye knew something the doctors were not saying. She did not know what exactly. She knew Ezell was sicker than they were acknowledging. She had been asking questions for years and receiving answers that slid past her questions without touching them. In 1947, she sat across from a PHS physician, not Meacham, who had moved on, but one of several rotating white physicians who came down from Washington or regional offices to conduct examinations. And she asked him directly what her husband had. The physician said he had bad blood, that the program was monitoring it, that he was receiving the best care available. She asked what bad blood was specifically. The physician said it was a blood condition that was common in this part of the country. She asked if the treatment was working. He said the program was doing everything it could. She asked if there was a medicine. She had heard from her neighbor, from the women at her church, that there was a medicine now that could fix certain blood conditions. She did not know the word penicillin. She had heard it described as a wonder drug. She asked if Ezell could have it. The physician said the program had its own treatment protocols, and that she should trust the program. She left the office with nothing. She had been given an answer to none of her questions. She had been given, instead, the performance of an answer, the confident institutional language, the reassuring professional tone, the structure of a response that produced the sensation of information while delivering none. She was a sharecropper's wife in 1947 Alabama, with a fourth-grade education, and she had just been managed. What she did not know, because she could not have known, was that the managing was intentional and documented. PHS protocols for the study included guidance on how to respond to participant inquiries about treatment. The guidance emphasized reassurance. It emphasized maintaining participant trust. It did not include telling the truth. By 1953, Ezel was very ill. His heart was failing. He went to his appointments in a neighbor's truck now because he could no longer walk the distance without stopping to rest. He still believed the program was treating him. He had believed this for 21 years, with the faithfulness of a man who had nothing else to trust, in a county and a country that had given him very little reason to trust anything. The study had given him the meals and the stipend, and the illusion of care, and in exchange it had taken from him something he had never known he was giving. The 21 years between 1932 and 1953, the years when penicillin could have stopped the progression, the years when the disease was consolidating itself in the chambers of his heart. He died in the spring of 1954. He was 65 years old. The cause of death recorded on his death certificate was cardiovascular disease. The study recorded him as a natural endpoint, a case completed. The data from his 22 years of participation was published, incorporated, cited. His name appeared in no paper. His wife was not told, at the time of his death or afterward, that he had been in a study that withheld treatment for his diagnosed syphilis. She was told, when she asked, that the program had done everything it could. Faye Tanner was 43 years old when Ezel died. Within the following year, she began to show symptoms. She went to the county health clinic, not the Tuskegee program, and was tested. The result was positive for syphilis. She was treated with penicillin. The treatment worked. She had been infected. The study's records would later confirm this, when those records were finally made available. For at least 7 years, the disease transmitted from her husband, who had carried it untreated for more than 2 decades. The study's records noted her as one of approximately 40 wives infected through the participants. This figure, 40 wives, appears in the summary documents produced during the congressional investigation in 1972 as a fact, a data point, a number in a table. Faye Tanner's name does not appear in those tables. She was not a subject. She was a secondary consequence. The study had not been designed to track wives. It had been designed to track the disease in the men it had enrolled. The wives were, in the language of public health documentation, collateral. 19 children were born with congenital syphilis to wives of study participants. These children had the disease from birth. The study's records acknowledge this number. There are no further details in the official documents. There were no compensatory programs, no follow-up care, no acknowledgement directed at these families. There was a number. The number appears in tables. The tables were published. The study continued. Meekum attended a conference in Atlanta in 1965, where he presented data from the study. He was 56 now, a senior figure in the PHS, a man whose curriculum vitae included more than 30 years of work in venereal disease research, a man with publications and commendations, and the kind of professional standing that insulates a person from questions about the foundational assumptions of their life's work. He spoke about the study with authority. He spoke about the longitudinal data, the progression rates, the cardiovascular findings, the neurological outcomes. He used the words subject and population and clinical presentation. He did not speak about Ezel Tanner. He did not speak about Faye Tanner. He did not speak about the draft board intervention or the penicillin that could have been given, or the burial insurance that had been offered at enrollment as evidence that the study had anticipated, from the beginning, that the men would die. He spoke about science. His colleagues listened. Several approached him afterward with questions about methodology. One asked about the serologic testing protocols. Another asked about the cardiac pathology findings, and whether there were plans to publish more detailed autopsy data. Nobody asked about consent. The year 1966 is the year that almost ended the study, and almost is the word that matters. Peter Buxton was 28 years old, a venereal disease investigator with the PHS in San Francisco, a man who had recently read documents pertaining to the Tuskegee study as part of his onboarding into the PHS system. What he read troubled him. He wrote a memo to his supervisors in November 1966, raising concerns about the study's ethical foundations, specifically about the withholding of treatment and the absence of informed consent. He asked whether the study should continue. The PHS convened a review committee in 1969. The review committee concluded that the study should continue. The committee's reasoning is preserved in its own documents. The men were old. Treatment might itself cause adverse effects in men of their age. The scientific value of the longitudinal data was substantial. The study had been running for 37 years, and it would be a waste of that accumulated data to terminate it prematurely. These arguments were not made by monsters. They were made by physicians and researchers who had spent their careers in public health and who had, through some combination of professional investment and institutional capture, and the particular moral blindness that comes from having stared at data long enough that the data stops being people, concluded that the continuation was justified. Buxton did not accept this conclusion. He was not able, through official channels, to stop the study. He was in fact transferred and eventually left the PHS, but he kept the documents. He kept them for 3 years. In 1972, he made a decision. He gave the documents to Jean Heller, an Associated Press reporter based in Washington. She took them, verified them, investigated them, and on July 25, 1972, the Associated Press published her story. The headline ran in newspapers across the country. The United States government, the story reported, had for 40 years withheld treatment from black men in Alabama who had syphilis, while telling them they were receiving care. The country responded with something between outrage and the particular paralysis that attends revelations so large they are difficult to metabolize. Senator Edward Kennedy held hearings. A class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the participants and their families. In 1973, the federal government reached a settlement, $10 million, divided among participants and their heirs, which worked out to approximately $30,000 per surviving participant. A sum that, for men who had spent their lives in the poverty of Macon County sharecropping, was not nothing, but which was also not, by any reasonable accounting, proportionate to what had been taken. In 1974, the National Research Act was signed into law, creating the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavioral Research. In 1979, the Belmont Report was published, establishing the ethical principles, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice that would govern human subjects research in the United States. The Tuskegee study is cited in the Belmont Report's background section as the primary impetus for the new framework. The study that killed and damaged the men of Macon County is, in the official history of biomedical ethics, the foundational case that produced the protections now extended to human research subjects. Those protections are real. They protect, primarily, the people who participate in clinical trials at research institutions. Those people are overwhelmingly white. By 1972, when the study ended, 28 men had died directly of syphilis. 100 had died of related complications. 40 wives had been infected. 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. The last participant enrolled in 1932 was still alive in 1972. Charlie Pollard, who had been 26 at enrollment and was 66 at the study's end, who had spent 40 years in a program that had used him as an instrument of data collection while telling him he was a patient. The United States government did not apologize until 1997, 25 years after the exposure. By then, of the 399 men originally enrolled, 8 were still alive. President Clinton held a ceremony at the White House. He spoke about betrayal. He spoke about the darkness of this moment in our nation's history. He apologized, on behalf of the government, to the 8 men who sat in the front row. One of them, Herman Shaw, a retired schoolteacher who had been enrolled in the study at age 26 and who was 94 years old in 1997, spoke about forgiveness. He said he had lived with this for a long time. He said he forgave the government. He said he hoped it would never happen again. The 8 survivors are all dead now. The apology came when almost everyone it was owed to was gone. The apology was real. It was also an act of political management. The timing of its delay, a quarter century after exposure, ensured that it would be made to the smallest possible audience, and at the maximum possible remove from the events that necessitated it. By 1997, most of the men who had suffered were not there to hear it. The suffering had already been processed into history. The nation could feel it had reckoned with something. The reckoning cost the government very little. It changed almost nothing in the foundational inequities of American medicine. And the distrust it had generated, this is the part that does not appear in the apology ceremony's official photographs. The distrust it had generated was not apology-soluble. The data on this distrust is now extensive. Survey after survey, study after study, finds that Black Americans are significantly less likely than white Americans to participate in clinical trials, to seek preventive care, to report pain to physicians, to follow medical recommendations. Researchers have spent years trying to explain this gap. Some have attributed it to cultural factors, to access issues, to socioeconomic variables. All of those variables are real, but the single most consistently cited factor, when Black Americans are asked directly, is distrust, specifically distrust of medical institutions based on historical experience. The Tuskegee study is named more often than any other factor when Black respondents are asked to explain their wariness of medical research and medical authority. This is not irrational. This is, in the most precise meaning of the word, evidence-based. The year 1951 had its own story, running parallel to Tuskegee, but with a different mechanism of extraction. If the Tuskegee study took time, the years and decades of these men's lives, what happened to Henrietta Lacks took something that her executors could not even name at first. A piece of her body, alive and growing, after she herself was dead. Henrietta Lacks was 31 years old when she came to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore in January of 1951. She had felt something wrong in herself for months, a heaviness in her lower abdomen, a bleeding that was irregular and wrong. She came to Hopkins because Hopkins was the only hospital in Baltimore that treated Black patients, not in the same wards or with the same amenities as white patients, not without the architectures of segregation that structured every aspect of institutional life in 1951, but treated. She was examined. She was diagnosed with cervical cancer. The diagnosis was late. The cancer was aggressive. She lived in Turner Station, a Black community on the industrial edge of Baltimore, Bethlehem Steel and the Chesapeake Bay within sight, the kind of community held together by the proximity of shared work and shared exclusion. Her neighbor Coretta Baines had watched her leave for Hopkins that January morning, watched her in the particular way that neighbors in close communities watch each other through difficulty, attentively, quietly, with the practical knowledge of what proximity to illness means, and the superstitious wish that watchfulness might help. Coretta had known Henrietta for 6 years, since before Henrietta's family had moved from Clover, Virginia. She knew the sound of Henrietta's laugh, which was large and genuine. She knew that Henrietta could cook in a way that made people stay longer than they had planned to. She knew that Henrietta had 5 children and a husband named Day, and a family connection to the same Clover County tobacco land that had shaped her childhood. She watched Henrietta leave for Hopkins, and she said, as Henrietta got into the car, "You be all right." It was not a question. What happened inside Hopkins that January was not known to Coretta, and would not be known to her or to Henrietta's family for more than 20 years. Before Henrietta was given her first radium treatment for the cancer, a sample of tissue was taken from her cervix. 2 samples, in fact, one from the tumor and one from the healthy tissue adjacent to it. This was not uncommon practice at Johns Hopkins in 1951. The hospital's policy did not require patients to be informed that tissue samples might be taken for research purposes. It did not require their consent for that use. The samples were taken, labeled, and sent to the laboratory of Dr. George Guy, who directed the hospital's tissue culture lab, and who had been working for years to culture human cells that could survive and divide outside a human body. Human cells, as of 1951, did not cooperate with this ambition. They died. Every culture Gay had grown had died within days or weeks, the cells unable to sustain themselves outside the specific biochemistry of a living organism. He had tried hundreds of samples from hundreds of patients. They all died. Henrietta Lacks's cells did not die. They grew. They divided. They kept dividing. Gay's assistant, Mary Kubitschek, noted the remarkable vitality of the cells within days of their arrival in the lab, a growth rate and robustness that distinguished them from every other culture they had worked with. Gay understood immediately what this meant. He named the line HeLa, from the first 2 letters of his patients' first and last names, and he began distributing samples to other researchers. Within months, the HeLa line had been shared with laboratories across the country. Within a year, it was being used to test the polio vaccine Jonas Salk was developing. Within a decade, HeLa cells were in laboratories on every inhabited continent. Henrietta Lacks died on October 4, 1951. She was 31 years old. She weighed under 90 pounds at the time of her death, the cancer having consumed her. She was buried in Clover, Virginia, in a grave that for years had no marker, a flat piece of ground in the family cemetery, undistinguished from the surrounding soil, the way she had come into the world, and the way she left it, without the formal acknowledgement that the institutions she had briefly intersected were extending, simultaneously, to her cells. Her cells were in 50 laboratories by the time she was buried. Her cells would be in 5,000 laboratories before her children were grown. The HeLa cell line became the substrate of 20th century biomedical research in a way that is difficult to overstate. Salk used HeLa cells to confirm that his polio vaccine worked. The vaccine that eliminated one of the most feared diseases in American history was validated on cells taken from a black woman in Baltimore without her knowledge. HeLa cells were used to develop cancer treatments, to study viral behavior, to map human chromosomes. They went into space. NASA sent them on early missions to study how cells responded to zero gravity. They were used in the development of the HPV vaccine, which protects against the same class of virus that likely caused Henrietta Lacks's cancer. They were used in AIDS research. They were used in COVID vaccine development. The list is not comprehensive because it cannot be made comprehensive. HeLa cells have been used in so many experiments, published in so many papers, that a full accounting would require its own library. They have been bought and sold by the billions. The HeLa cell line is a commercial product, distributed by biological supply companies, purchased by laboratories at hundreds of dollars per vial. The market for HeLa cells and HeLa-derived products has, over the decades since 1951, generated revenues in the billions of dollars. The company Thermo Fisher Scientific, which distributes HeLa cells among many other biological products, has annual revenues in the tens of billions. Henrietta Lacks was buried in an unmarked grave. Her family did not know about the cells for more than 20 years. They found out, in the early 1970s, not through any formal notification from Johns Hopkins or from the researchers who had used the cells, but through a combination of journalistic investigation and the kind of accidental discovery that results from a journalist calling the family of a woman whose cells he has just encountered, referenced in a laboratory manual. The family's reaction, when they understood what had happened, that Henrietta's cells were alive, that they were everywhere, that they had been sold and used and distributed, and that none of this had ever been communicated to them, defies easy summary. It was grief and confusion, and something that required the word betrayal in the same way the Tuskegee exposure required it. The revelation that an institution had taken something without asking and without telling. Henrietta's daughter Deborah spent years trying to understand what had been done and why. She was interviewed by Rebecca Skloot, whose 2010 book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks brought the story to a broad public audience and forced a reckoning that Hopkins and the research community had for 60 years managed to avoid. Hopkins issued statements of regret. Researchers spoke about how practices had changed, how consent frameworks were now in place, how the situation that allowed cells to be taken from Henrietta Lacks in 1951 could not happen now. What they did not do, for a very long time, was acknowledge the economic dimension of what had been taken. They spoke about ethics. They did not speak about money. The HeLa cell market continued. The cell lines continued to be sold. The family continued to lack health insurance. Henrietta's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, living in the same economic circumstances as their ancestors, could not afford the medical care that was being advanced in labs around the world on the cells of the woman who was their grandmother. In 2023, the Lacks family reached a legal settlement with Thermo Fisher Scientific. The terms were not publicly disclosed. It was by any measure 72 years late. Henrietta Lacks had been taken from in 1951, and her family had waited until 2023 for any portion of what had been taken from them. Whatever the settlement amount was, it cannot be an accounting. It can only be an acknowledgement. Here is what the economics of extraction look like, held in a single frame. A black woman's cells are taken from her body without her knowledge. Those cells become the foundational material of the biomedical industry. Careers are built on them. Nobel Prizes are won with research enabled by them. Vaccines are developed that protect hundreds of millions of people. The companies that sell them generate billions in revenue. The woman's family cannot afford health insurance. The system that took from Henrietta Lacks and gave to everyone else was not operating outside its own logic. It was operating precisely according to its own logic. The logic was the same logic that made Anarcha's body available to Sims in 1845, that made Ezel Tanner's illness available to the PHS in 1932. The logic is, whose bodies are available for use? The answer, across 127 years of American medical history, was consistent. The bodies available for use were black bodies. The benefits of that use flowed outward, broadly, to patients of all races, and the people whose bodies had provided the raw material for those benefits lived in unmarked graves and without health insurance, and with their names absent from the papers and the patents and the award citations and the statues. In the same decade that Henrietta Lacks was dying at Hopkins, other things were happening in American laboratories that the public would not know about for 40 years. The Cold War had generated, in the federal government and in the research institutions that contracted with it, an appetite for experiments that the ordinary structures of consent and ethical review might not have permitted. The Department of Defense needed to understand radiation, specifically how much radiation the human body could absorb and what the effects of that absorption would be. The atomic bomb had produced a new category of military and public health concern: And the information needed to address that concern could not be gathered from animal models alone. It needed to come from human beings. The human beings selected for this purpose were, consistently, human beings who could be considered expendable by the institutional calculus of mid-century American medicine and government. At Vanderbilt University in the 1940s, 829 pregnant women who attended the university's prenatal clinic received drinks they were told were vitamin supplements. The drinks contained radioactive iron. The purpose was to study how radioactive substances were absorbed and processed by the maternal body and transmitted to the developing fetus. The women were not told they were receiving radioactive material. They were not told they were in an experiment. They were told they were getting vitamins. Many of the women were poor. Many were black. The clinic served the community that had no other prenatal care options. At least 3 of the children born to these women developed cancers in childhood that were later attributed to radiation exposure in utero. In Cincinnati, from the late 1950s through the early 1970s, Dr. Eugene Sanger, a radiologist at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center, conducted experiments funded by the Department of Defense that exposed cancer patients to whole-body radiation at doses far in excess of any therapeutic purpose. The patients were told the radiation was a treatment for their cancer. Many of them experienced severe, sometimes fatal side effects from the doses, which were not calibrated for their therapeutic benefit, but for the DoD's interest in understanding how large doses of radiation affected human physiology, with the eventual application of informing military response protocols for nuclear warfare. The patients Sanger selected were disproportionately black and poor. Cincinnati General Hospital, where the experiments were conducted, was a public institution serving the city's indigent population. The patients who came to it came because they had nowhere else to go. They had cancer. They were told they were being treated. The consent forms they signed, when consent forms were used at all, which was not consistently, described the procedures as therapeutic rather than experimental. The distinction is not small. Moses Clay had been 62 years old when he enrolled in what he understood to be a treatment program at Cincinnati General in 1968. He was 78 when he sat across a table from a journalist in 1984 in a Cincinnati apartment where the air smelled like medicine and the afternoon light came through a window that looked onto a courtyard where nobody sat. He had a particular manner of speaking, deliberate, not slow, but considered, with the quality of a man who has learned over many decades that the specific word matters, that the imprecise word gets you managed, gets you reassured and redirected back out the door with nothing. He had been managed many times. He knew what it felt like. They said it was treatment, he told the journalist. He looked at his hands. They were an old man's hands, large and calloused from the decades of work he'd done before the cancer. I trusted that it was treatment. I trusted that the doctors were doing what they said. He paused. Now I know what they were doing. I know what I was. He did not sound angry. He sounded like a man who had metabolized something very hard and was now just describing it, the way you describe the weather or a fact of geography. I was an experiment, a poor black man with cancer in a hospital that had government money. That's what I was to them. He looked up. I'm not saying they hated me. I'm saying they didn't have to hate me. They just didn't have to think of me as a person. That was enough. Moses Clay died of cancer in 1991. His family was informed during the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments convened by President Clinton in 1994 that the radiation he had received at Cincinnati General was part of a Department of Defense-funded experiment. They were offered the committee's findings and an expression of regret. The committee's report, published in 1995, confirmed that experiments involving radiation exposure had been conducted on patients without adequate informed consent. that the subjects were disproportionately drawn from poor and minority communities, and that the federal government had funded and approved these experiments. The report also concluded that the experiments had been conducted by credentialed researchers at accredited institutions, approved through available institutional channels, and published in peer-reviewed medical journals. This was, the committee noted, part of what made the ethical failure so systemic. It was not a failure of rogue actors. It was a failure of the system itself. The system had approved what the system should have prevented. The same committee that documented the failure was convened by the government that had funded the experiments it was documenting. This is the circularity in which institutional accountability lives, the institution that did the harm. Investigating the harm the institution did, producing a report that the institution can cite as evidence that it took the harm seriously. The Department of Defense declined to admit legal liability. The University of Cincinnati ultimately settled civil lawsuits brought by families of experiment subjects for a sum that the university did not publicly disclose. There is a study from 2016 that should be read alongside the history of J. Marion Sims. Researchers at the University of Virginia surveyed medical students and residents, people training to become doctors in the present day, in the 21st century, in American medical schools, and asked them a series of questions about biological differences between black and white patients. Among the items on the survey were statements like, "Black people's skin is thicker than white people's skin," and "black people's nerve endings are less sensitive than white people's nerve endings." Approximately 50% of the white medical students and residents surveyed endorsed at least one of these false beliefs as true. 171 years after Sims operated on Anarcha without anesthesia, because he believed black people did not feel pain the same way white people did, 50% of white medical trainees in the United States still held a version of the same belief. The study's authors correlated these false beliefs with treatment recommendations. Students who endorsed the false biological beliefs about black patients recommended lower doses of pain medication for black patients in clinical scenarios than for identical scenarios involving white patients. They were less likely to recommend referrals. They were less likely to trust black patients' self-reports of pain. The connection is direct. The line runs from Montgomery, Alabama in 1845 to a medical school classroom in 2016, and it is not a line that was ever fully severed. It was a belief system that was published as medical science, taught in medical schools, embodied in institutional practice, and never formally retracted. The textbooks that contained it were not pulled. The papers that advanced it were not formally debunked in the curriculum. The belief persisted because it was never systematically challenged. It simply aged from active doctrine to unexamined assumption to something that 50% of medical trainees, asked directly, turned out to still hold. This is what the phrase persistent myth obscures. The belief that black patients feel less pain was not a myth in the way that myths are understood, as an error that simply survives through inertia. It was, for most of its history, a doctrine, promoted, published, institutionally sanctioned, and instrumentally useful. It made possible the things that were done. If it had been random error, it would have distributed its effects randomly. It did not. It consistently resulted in black patients receiving less pain medication, less attentive care, later diagnoses, and worse outcomes. This is not the pattern of an error. It is the pattern of a policy. The outcomes that result from this pattern are visible in the data. Black maternal mortality in the United States is 3 times higher than white maternal mortality, the highest gap of any racial group, and one that cannot be explained by income or education alone, because the gap persists and in some analyses widens among college-educated and higher-income black women. Black patients with cancer receive different, and measurably worse, pain management than white patients with comparable diagnoses. Black patients experiencing cardiac symptoms wait longer in emergency rooms. Black patients are less likely to receive adequate anesthesia during surgical procedures. A 2020 study of emergency room data found that black children in pain were less likely to receive any pain medication than white children with the same presenting symptoms. These numbers are the legacy of Anarcha's 30 surgeries, not directly, not causally, in the narrow mechanistic sense, but structurally. The assumptions that made those surgeries possible are the ancestors of the assumptions that produce these numbers now. The false biological beliefs that Sims articulated and that the medical establishment encoded have descendants in every underprescribed pain medication, every delayed referral, every dismissed self-report. And over this entire landscape, the clinics and the hospitals, and the emergency rooms and the waiting rooms where black patients wait longer, lies the shadow of Tuskegee. Researchers have documented the effect of the Tuskegee disclosure on black Americans' engagement with the medical system. There is evidence that the 1972 AP story produced a measurable, quantifiable decline in black male engagement with medical care, that the revelation of what had been done to the men of Macon County was followed, in the subsequent years, by a reduction in life expectancy among black men in the counties most closely connected to the story's exposure, because men who learned what had been done to their community in the name of medical treatment chose not to seek care they now could not trust. A 2016 economics paper estimated that the disclosure of the Tuskegee study accounted for a meaningful portion of the black-white gap in male life expectancy that opened in the 1970s and 1980s. The medical establishment sometimes uses this statistic to argue that the disclosure was, in a sense, harmful, that knowing what had been done was more dangerous than not knowing. This argument is worth examining carefully because it places the cost of the betrayal on the people who were betrayed, rather than on the people who did the betraying. The men of Macon County were not killed by the knowledge that the study had withheld their treatment. They were killed by the withholding of treatment. The communities that reduced their engagement with medical institutions after 1972 did not do so irrationally. They did so on the basis of evidence. The fact that this rational response to documented betrayal produced measurable health costs is an indictment of the system that made the betrayal possible, not of the communities that responded to it with appropriate caution. The vaccine hesitancy documented in black communities during the COVID-19 pandemic was analyzed extensively by public health researchers, journalists, and commentators. Many of those analyses invoked Tuskegee as the historical root of contemporary distrust. This is correct, though incomplete. Tuskegee is the most famous and the most extensively documented example. It is not the only one. The reluctance to take a vaccine developed in part on HeLa cell lines offered by an institution that had taken those cells without consent, distributed through a public health system with a documented history of experimenting on black bodies without disclosure. This reluctance does not require the specific memory of Tuskegee to be historically grounded. It requires only the general and accurate knowledge that the medical establishment has, repeatedly and systematically, treated black bodies as raw material. That knowledge is not paranoia. It is history. The woman who owns this history most completely, the woman at the center of the pattern from 1845 forward, is not Henrietta Lacks, though Henrietta Lacks is perhaps the most visible name now. The woman who owns this history most completely is Anarcha, whose last name is not known, whose birth year is not recorded, whose life after J. Marion Sims's experiments concluded has no documentary trace. What is known is this: she was enslaved. She was approximately 17 years old in 1845 when she was brought to Sims after a labor that killed her baby and left her injured in a way that made her useful to Sims's research program. She underwent 30 surgeries over 4 years. She received no anesthesia for any of them. The technique developed through those surgeries became the foundation of a medical specialty. The specialty built hospitals and journals and training programs and a global community of practitioners. The specialty saved, and continues to save, the lives of women around the world, of every race, of every nation. Anarcha has no statue in Central Park. She has no hospitals named after her. She is listed in J. Marion Sims's notes as one of his primary surgical subjects, and that record is the entirety of her official trace in American medical history. Her contributions to the field are not classified as contributions. They are classified, in the institutional memory of the field she built, as nothing at all. In 2018, when the statue of Sims was removed from Central Park, there were people who grieved the removal as an erasure of history. There is a sense in which they were right about that, though not the sense they meant. The statue's removal was, in fact, a confrontation with history, a refusal to let the sanitized version of it continue to occupy public space. The statue had been there since 1894, and its presence was a kind of teaching, a continuous public lesson in whose contributions were worth memorializing and whose were not. The empty pedestal that remained after the removal was, for a time, its own teaching, a negative space that said, "We honored the wrong person, and we are not yet sure how to correct it." In the years since the removal, there have been proposals to erect monuments to Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. In 2021, a monument to the three women was unveiled at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. A bronze figure, a woman with her hand extended, which some see as receiving and some see as protecting, and which is, in either reading, a beginning. The monument was placed not in Central Park, but at a medical school, a building dedicated to the training of physicians, which is perhaps the right location, placed where the people who will go on to practice medicine in this country will see it every day, and will be asked, by its presence, to remember something about whose bodies their specialty was built on. It is not Anarcha's name. It is three women's names together, which is not quite right, but is closer than nothing. She still has no individual monument in Central Park, or anywhere in New York City, or anywhere that the runners and the tourists and the pigeons will encounter her without seeking. The city that stood his statue for 124 years has not yet found a way to stand hers. She is owed 124 years of interest. Here is what has been built on black bodies in American medicine. The speculum, the instrument so basic to gynecological examination that it is handed to medical students in their first weeks as an artifact of foundational knowledge, was developed by Sims through his surgeries on Anarcha. The surgical technique for the repair of vesicovaginal fistula, a procedure performed routinely in hospitals across the world, was developed through those same surgeries. The HeLa cell line, the substrate of vaccines and cancer treatments and genetic research that has shaped the entire trajectory of 20th and 21st century biomedicine, came from Henrietta Lacks. The ethics framework that now governs human subjects research, codified in the Belmont Report and embodied in every institutional review board that reviews every research protocol in every American university and hospital. This framework exists because of what was done to the men of Macon County, Alabama. The radiation safety protocols developed through the Cold War experiments are in use in hospitals today. The long-term cardiovascular data on syphilis progression collected through the Tuskegee study, whatever the monstrousness of its collection, has been cited in the medical literature. The raw material was black. The benefits were distributed elsewhere. This is not a metaphor. It is an accounting. The question of what is owed to Anarcha, to Ezell Tanner, to Faye Tanner, to Henrietta Lacks and her family, to Moses Clay, to the unnamed women at Vanderbilt who drank radioactive iron because they thought it was vitamins, to the children born with congenital syphilis in Macon County. This question has never been answered by the institutions that accumulated the debt. What has been offered are apologies, some of them sincere, and investigations, some of them thorough, and reforms, some of them real. What has not been offered is proportionality. The apology Clinton made in 1997 to 8 old men in a White House ceremony was real, and it was 25 years late, and it cost the government nothing that the government would not have spent anyway. The settlement with Thermo Fisher Scientific in 2023 was real, and it was 72 years late, and the terms were not disclosed. The statute of limitations, in American medicine's relationship with its own history, has always worked in one direction. The last photograph taken of Anarcha in the historical record is not a photograph. It is a reference in Sims's notes, dated 1849, noting that the procedure on the patient he called Anarcha had finally achieved the result he had been seeking. The fistula was repaired. The 43rd attempt had succeeded. He recorded the result with satisfaction. He recorded it in the language of a man documenting a scientific achievement, which is what it was, and in the language of a man who understood the woman before him as a case rather than a person, which is what the system required him to understand. She was 21 years old, approximately, in 1849. She had been in Sims's care for 4 years. She had been operated on 30 times without anesthesia. She had provided the data from which the technique was derived. She had, in the language of the study she could not have consented to, and did not know she was in, been a subject. What happened to her after that is not recorded, whether she was returned to her owner, whether she lived another 10 years or 50, whether she had children of her own, whether she ever was in a position to use the technique her body had been used to perfect. There is no record. She walked out of Sims's outbuilding and out of the archive and into the part of history that holds the names of people who were used and then released and then forgotten, the vast dark space that is not emptiness, but is simply the absence of documentation, which is a different thing. She was there. She endured what she endured. She built what she built. The man got the statue. For 124 years, the man got the statue. In 2018, the crane came and took the statue down. The pedestal stood empty. The city had removed the wrong monument and had not yet built the right one. These things take longer than they should, which is itself a finding, a data point in the long study of what a society considers worthy of public memory and what it considers erasable. Anarcha, Lucy, Betsy. 3 names that should have been on the pedestal from the beginning, in place of the man who used their bodies to put his own name there. The experiment America forgot was never secret. The records were there. The papers were published. The medical journals contain it all. The clinical language, the serologic tables, the cardiovascular pathology data, the culture growth rates. The experiment was not hidden. It was simply not looked at from the angle of the people it was done to. It was looked at from the angle of the people it was done for. The careers advanced, the specialties founded, the vaccines developed, the ethics frameworks constructed from the wreckage. Look at it from the other angle. Look at it from the angle of Anarcha on the table. From Ezel Tanner walking out of the examination room, grateful. From Faye Tanner asking questions she was not allowed to have answered. From Henrietta Lacks buried in an unmarked grave while her cells circled the globe. From Moses Clay understanding at the end of his life that the word treatment had been used against him like a weapon. From that angle, the experiment did not end in 1972. It did not end with the Belmont Report, or Clinton's apology, or the removal of a statue. It is ongoing in the black maternal mortality rate. It is ongoing in the medical school classrooms where 50% of white students still carry a version of the belief that black patients feel less pain. It is ongoing in every clinical trial that cannot recruit black participants because the history of recruitment for the Tuskegee study has made the word enroll sound like a threat. The experiments America forgot are the foundation. The building constructed on that foundation still stands. The building is called Modern Medicine, and it has saved millions of lives, and it was built on black bodies, and the full accounting of that has never been rendered. Anarka's name is in the archive. Her name is there in Sims's notes in the citation that led the researchers back to her. In the monument at Birmingham that is smaller than the one Sims had, and in a city that fewer people will visit. She is in the record. She has been in the record for 175 years. The question is not whether she is findable. The question is whether we have been willing to look. That is not a rhetorical question. It has a measurable answer, and the measurement is in the outcomes data, in the trust gap, in the vaccination rates, in the empty pedestal in Central Park that still has not, as of this writing, been replaced with a monument to the women who built what the man on the pedestal received credit for building. That credit was always owed elsewhere. So was the marble, and the bronze, and the name cut into the stone. It still is.